They said Zaid Kestrel was a man who couldn't be caught off guard. In the dark, humid air of a South Side warehouse, Zaid stood over his latest acquisition, his shadow looming against the rusted metal of a decommissioned armored van. He had his hand pinned above her head, his breath hot against her skin, demanding names. He thought he had captured a pawn. He thought she was just a beautiful mistake caught in the crossfire of a Mafia war. But Inara Jinx didn't look like a woman who was afraid. As she leaned back against the cold steel, her eyes weren't searching for an exit, they were studying him like a hunter studies a prize. "You were warned about the cargo tonight, Zaid," she whispered, her voice a silk-wrapped blade that sent a chill down his spine. "But nobody warned you about me." In that moment, the silence of the warehouse felt like the ticking of a bomb. Zaid Kestrel had spent a decade building a fortress around his heart and his throne. He had accounted for every variable, every traitor, and every rival boss. But he hadn't accounted for her. And by the time he realized she was the one pulling the strings, it was already too late. "Hello, my beautiful family. I am truly so glad you've decided to spend a part of your day here with me. Before we dive into the shadows of today's tale, I want to check in with you. I hope your morning, or your evening, has been kind. And if it hasn't, I hope this space can be your sanctuary, a place where you can just breathe, let the world outside fade away, and escape into a story for a while. If this is your very first time here, welcome home. You are already a part of this big family. Do take a moment to like and subscribe, it truly helps our circle grow, and it is the only reason these characters, like Zaid and Inara, can come to life. And please, say hello in the comments. Tell me where in the world you're watching from today. Now, I want you to let go of the day's stress. Get comfortable, grab your popcorn or a warm drink, and let's step into this world together. Today, we meet a man who thought he owned the city, and a woman who proved him wrong. The drive from the warehouse took 40 minutes. Inara counted every one of them. She sat in the back of Zaid's SUV with her wrists unbound, a deliberate choice on his part, she knew. A message. You're not a prisoner. You're a guest. The distinction was cosmetic. The two men flanking her hadn't said a word since they'd pulled out of the South Side, and the partition between her and Zaid was sealed shut, but she could feel him on the other side of it the same way you feel a storm before it breaks, that low, pressurized certainty that something enormous is paying attention to you. She kept her breathing even and watched the city dissolve into something quieter. Wider streets. Higher walls. The kind of neighborhood that didn't appear on the maps ordinary people used. When the gates opened, she understood immediately what kind of man Zaid Kestrel believed himself to be. The estate was beautiful the way a blade is beautiful, precise, cold, and designed entirely around the purpose of control. The main house rose against the night sky in clean stone and dark glass, every light positioned to illuminate and expose rather than welcome. The grounds were immaculate. The silence was absolute. Even the guards at the perimeter moved like men who had learned a long time ago that unnecessary sound was a form of weakness. Inara stepped out of the SUV and tilted her head back, taking it all in. "Comfortable prison," she said, to no one in particular. Zaid appeared at her shoulder so quietly that a lesser woman would have flinched. She didn't give him the satisfaction. "Guest quarters," he said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" He looked at her for a long moment, that same look from the warehouse, the one that moved over her face like he was cataloging rather than admiring, and then he turned and walked toward the house without answering. She followed, because that was what the plan required, and because the alternative was standing in his driveway alone at midnight looking defiant and going nowhere. The room they gave her was on the second floor. West wing. Corner position, 2 exterior walls, both with windows that had been fitted with glass thick enough to stop a conversation and probably a bullet. The bed was dressed in charcoal linen. There was a decanter of something amber on the sideboard, and a bouquet of white flowers she didn't recognize on the table by the window. Expensive. deliberately chosen. The whole room was a performance of civility wrapped around the architecture of a cage. She sat on the edge of the bed and waited. Zaid came to the doorway but didn't cross the threshold. Another message. I have manners. I have rules. I am not what you think I am. He leaned against the frame with his arms folded, and even in the low light of the hallway she could see the tension he was carrying in his jaw, the way his eyes hadn't quite settled since the warehouse. She'd done that to him. Good. You'll stay here until I figure out what to do with you, he said. You make it sound so romantic. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not quite amusement, too controlled for that, but adjacent to it, the way a man looks when he's caught off guard by something small and doesn't want you to know it. You were in Reyes's warehouse. I need to know why. I told you in the warehouse. You told me a name and a direction. I need the rest. Inara looked at him steadily. Then I suppose you'll have to keep me comfortable until I decide to give it to you. The silence that followed had weight. She'd learned years ago that silence was its own kind of weapon, that most people couldn't hold it, couldn't resist the pull to fill it, to explain themselves, to soften whatever they'd just said into something more palatable. Zaid Kestrel held it like it cost him nothing. He looked at her across the room and the distance between them felt simultaneously too large and dangerously small. Good night, Inara, he said finally. The door didn't lock. That was the cruelest part. He didn't need to lock it because he knew, and he knew that she knew, that walking out of here tonight would only deliver her back into the hands of the people she'd allegedly been running from. The walls of the golden cage weren't stone. They were logic. They were his certainty that she had nowhere else to go. She listened to his footsteps move down the corridor and forced herself to breathe normally. She was exactly where she needed to be. She found the kitchen at 2:30 in the morning, following the logic that a man like Zaid would have a household staff that worked quietly and early, which meant the kitchen would be empty in the hours between. She was right. The space was vast and brutally organized, every surface clear, every implement in its place, and she stood at the counter drinking water from a glass that probably cost more than some people's rent and thought about the next 72 hours. She didn't hear him come in. That bothered her more than she allowed herself to show. You don't sleep. It wasn't a question. Zaid had changed, dark trousers, a shirt with the top buttons undone, the holster gone from his shoulder for the first time since she'd met him. He looked less like a weapon and more like a man, which was arguably more dangerous. He moved to the other side of the island and poured himself something from a bottle she hadn't noticed on the shelf, and the silence between them shifted into something textured and strange. Do you? She returned. Not much. He studied the glass in his hand. Not when there's something I haven't figured out yet. And I'm the something. His eyes came up to hers and stayed there, and for exactly 3 seconds the space between them was nothing but that, two people in the dark and the enormous, inconvenient electricity of mutual recognition. You're not what you're pretending to be. She saw it in his face. He saw the same in hers. Neither of them said it, because naming it would have made it real, and neither of them was ready for what real would cost. He looked away first. She noted it. There are rules in this house, he said, his voice dropping back into its usual register, flat, controlled, deliberate. You don't go near my office. You don't speak to my men without me present. You don't leave the grounds. And in exchange? In exchange, you're safe. Inara set her glass down. Looked at him across the width of the island, across the careful geography of everything they weren't saying. I've never needed anyone to keep me safe, Zaid. He said nothing. But he didn't leave, either. And neither did she. They stood in his immaculate kitchen in the dark quiet of 3 in the morning, and the ticking that had started in the warehouse, that slow, inevitable countdown, grew just a little louder. It happened on the 3rd day. Not because Inara was impatient, patience was the one weapon she'd never had to sharpen, it had come to her naturally, the way some people are born with perfect pitch or an instinct for cruelty. She could wait. She had waited longer, in worse places, for smaller returns. But 3 days inside Zaid Kestrel's estate had given her something she hadn't anticipated, a rhythm. And rhythm, she'd learned, was how you found the cracks. His household operated like a military installation dressed in expensive furniture. The staff moved on fixed schedules. The guards rotated every 6 hours at the perimeter and every 4 on the interior. His 2 senior lieutenants, a quiet man named Draco who never made eye contact and a sharper, younger one called Ren who made too much of it, arrived each morning by 9 and left by midnight. Zaid himself kept hours that suggested he either didn't sleep or had made a private arrangement with exhaustion that the rest of the world wasn't privy to. She catalogued all of it. She catalogued the way the East Corridor camera had a 4-second delay on its rotation. The way the study door didn't fully latch unless you pulled it toward you as you closed it. The way Zaid always paused at the top of the staircase before descending, just a beat, just long enough to scan the ground floor, as though he needed to confirm the shape of his own house before he trusted it. She catalogued him most of all. On the 3rd morning she was in the library, a room she'd been granted access to, presumably because Zaid had decided books were insufficiently weaponizable, when she heard it. 2 voices in the adjacent sitting room, the door not quite shut, Ren's tone stripped of its usual confidence and replaced with something thinner. The ledger access was logged at 2 a.m. No one on staff has clearance at that hour. Draco pulled the server record, the entry point was internal. Someone inside the network. A pause. Then Zaid's voice, quieter and therefore more dangerous. How deep? Far enough to see the distribution routes. Not far enough to pull them. Inara turned a page she hadn't read and kept her breathing slow. She waited until the voices moved away before she set the book down. Then she sat for a long moment, running the numbers, weighing the variables, making the kind of cold calculation that had kept her operational through 4 years of work that officially didn't exist. What she'd overheard wasn't useful to her mission yet. But it was an opening, small, unguarded, the precise shape of a door left ajar, and Inara Jinx had built her entire career on walking through those. She found Zaid in the corridor outside the East Wing office 40 minutes later. She had timed her exit from the library to make the encounter feel accidental. Most things that looked accidental around her were not. "You have a problem," she said. He stopped walking. Turned. The look he gave her was the one she was becoming familiar with, layered, assessing, the top layer cold and the layers beneath it considerably more complicated. "I have several. This one is specific." She kept her voice neutral, her posture easy, communicating absolutely nothing she didn't intend to communicate. "Your breach. Whoever accessed your network at 2 this morning came in through an internal node, which means it wasn't an outside hack. It was a relay. Someone gave a remote actor a temporary credential and let them ghost through from inside." She paused. "The entry point will look clean on your main log. It won't look clean on your auxiliary thermal monitor, if you have one, because the relay would have generated a secondary heat signature on the server stack. 30 seconds of elevated processing. Easy to miss if you're only looking at the access record." The silence was different from the ones before. Those had been weighted with suspicion and electricity. This one had something sharper in it, the particular quality of silence that falls over a man when the world has just rearranged itself slightly against his will. "Why would you tell me that?" he asked. "Because I'm bored," she said. "And because whoever is moving against you is also moving against the people who put me in that warehouse. Which makes your problem adjacent to mine." It was true. That was the elegant part. The best lies always had a skeleton of truth inside them. It was what kept them upright under pressure. Zaid looked at her for a long moment that she bore without flinching. Then he turned and walked toward the office, and he didn't tell her not to follow. She kept 2 steps behind him and kept her face entirely neutral and did not allow herself to feel anything about the fact that she was being let further in. The auxiliary thermal monitor showed exactly what she'd said it would. She watched Zaid study the readout, the slight shift in his posture, the way his hand came up to the back of his neck in a gesture that she was learning meant he was recalibrating rather than retreating. Ren stood across the room looking at her with an expression balanced precisely between gratitude and distrust. Draco didn't look at her at all, which told her he was the smarter of the two. The relay credential was generated 6 days ago, Ren said, pulling up a secondary screen. That's before, he stopped. Before she arrived, Zaid finished quietly. He didn't look at Inara when he said it, but the implication hung in the air anyway. A small gift he was giving her, partial exoneration delivered without fanfare, the closest thing to trust that a man like him was probably capable of in 72 hours. She didn't thank him for it. Gratitude would have been overplaying it. You have someone on the inside, she said instead, because keeping the focus on the problem and off herself was always the correct move. Someone who's been positioned long enough to seem clean. The 6-day window is the tell. They generated the credential before the warehouse operation, which means they knew what was coming. They were preparing an exit route for your data before the dust settled. Zaid turned from the screen and looked at her properly for the first time since they'd entered the room. Whatever calculation he was running behind his eyes, she couldn't fully read it, and that small uncertainty was the most honest thing she'd felt in 3 days. How do you know any of this? He asked. I know a lot of things. That's not an answer. No, she agreed. It's not. He held her gaze and she held his, and the room felt smaller than it had when they'd walked in. Ren was watching them both with the uncomfortable attention of a man witnessing something he didn't have the vocabulary for. Draco had still not looked up. Zaid broke first, not in any way that conceded anything, just a fractional shift, a decision being made somewhere beneath the surface. I want a full sweep of the staff credential logs going back 30 days, he said to Ren, his eyes still on Inara. And get her a guest access terminal. Ren hesitated. Boss. Did I ask you? The room went quiet. Ren left. Draco followed without being told. And Zaid stood in the diminished silence of his own office, looking at the woman he'd pulled from a warehouse 3 days ago, feeling the first hairline fracture form in the architecture of his certainty. He told himself it was pragmatism. He told himself she was useful. He told himself a great many things in the space of that single moment. The crack, small as it was, had already let the light in. The invitation arrived on a Thursday. Inara watched Zaid's expression when Ren handed it to him across the breakfast table, a cream envelope, heavyweight stock, the kind of paper that announced its own importance before you'd read a single word. His face did nothing visible, which she had learned meant the opposite of nothing. He set it beside his coffee and finished what he was saying to Draco and didn't open it until both men had left the room. She was still at the far end of the table with her own coffee and the financial section of a newspaper she was reading primarily to have something to look at that wasn't him. The Marchetti Gala, he said. She turned a page. I don't know what that is. Yes, you do. She looked up. He was watching her with that particular steadiness of his, not aggressive, not accusatory, just relentlessly observant, the way a man looks when he's decided to stop pretending he's not paying attention. The envelope sat open in front of him. Councilman Marchetti hosts a fundraiser every year. Every syndicate family in the city attends. It's the one night everyone agrees to be civilized. And you're going. We're going. He held her gaze. You'll be more useful to me in the room than you are here. And I want to see who reacts to you. She set the newspaper down. The job had just accelerated by approximately 2 weeks, and she allowed herself exactly none of the satisfaction that observation produced. I'll need something to wear. Already handled. Of course it was. The dress was midnight blue, structured at the shoulders, fluid everywhere else. the kind of garment that had been designed by someone who understood that the most effective armor looks like it isn't. It fit her with a precision that suggested Zaid had either an unsettling eye for detail or access to her measurements from somewhere she didn't want to think about. Both options were equally plausible. She stood in front of the mirror in her room and looked at herself with the cool, clinical attention of someone doing a final weapons check. She looked, she thought, exactly like what she needed to look like tonight. Dangerous without appearing to try. Zaid was waiting in the entrance hall when she came down the stairs. He was in a dark suit that had been cut with the same philosophy as her dress, expensive enough to communicate power, understated enough to suggest he didn't need to announce it. He watched her descend without moving, without speaking, and the only thing that gave him away was the single moment, fractional, quickly controlled, where his gaze moved over her and forgot to be calculating. She filed it carefully and said nothing. The Marchetti estate was lit like a stage set, which was precisely what it was. The gala occupied 3 interconnected ballrooms and a terrace that overlooked a garden strung with warm light, and by the time Zaid's car joined the line of arriving vehicles, Inara had already identified 4 people she recognized and 2 exits that didn't appear on the publicly available floor plan. They entered together and the room rearranged itself around them in the subtle, immediate way rooms do when someone significant walks in. She felt the attention move across Zaid like a tide and watched how he wore it, not performing, not deflecting, simply present in that total, unhurried way of his, as though the weight of 100 eyes was a climate he'd grown up in. She stayed half a step behind his right shoulder and read the room. By the first hour she had counted 3 men whose smiles didn't reach their eyes when they shook Zaid's hand. 2 women who watched him from across the room with the careful attention of people who had reasons to. 1 man, older, silver-haired, positioned near the East Terrace doors with the ease of someone who'd chosen that spot deliberately, who hadn't looked at Zaid once, which meant he was almost certainly thinking about him constantly. She was cataloging the silver-haired man when Councilman Marchetti's associate touched her elbow. "Miss Jinx." The voice was pleasant and entirely without warmth. The councilman would like a word. She felt Zaid go still beside her. "She's with me," he said. "Of course." Just a brief moment. The smile widened without becoming more genuine. "Privately." The pause that followed had the compressed quality of a held breath. Inara put her hand lightly on Zaid's arm, the first time she had touched him voluntarily, and she felt him register it the way you feel a circuit complete, and said, easily, "I'll find you at the bar." She followed Marchetti's man through a side door and into a smaller room off the main corridor, where Councilman Marchetti himself was waiting with 2 other men she identified in under 4 seconds. One was a city official whose name appeared in 4 of the distribution route files she'd reviewed on Zaid's guest terminal. The other was the silver-haired man from the terrace. "Miss Jinx," Marchetti said. "Or should I use a different name?" "This one is fine," she said pleasantly. "We want to know what you're doing with Kestrel." She looked at him with the particular expression she had developed for rooms exactly like this one, open, untroubled, faintly curious, revealing absolutely nothing. "Surviving," she said. "Same as everyone." The silver-haired man stepped forward. He was closer to 70 than 60, with the eyes of someone who had outlasted several people who'd underestimated him. "You were in the Reyes warehouse. Reyes is dead. Kestrel has you under his roof and apparently under his protection." He paused. "That's a very specific sequence of events for a woman nobody can find a file on." "I'm private," she said. "We want the ledger," Marchetti said, dropping the pleasantries like a coat he was tired of wearing. "Kestrel's distribution ledger. You have access to his systems." "We know you do. Get it to us before the month is out and you walk away from all of this clean." Inara looked at him for a moment. Then she smiled, the real one, the one she almost never used, the one that tended to make people feel, obscurely and accurately, that they had made some kind of terrible mistake. "I'll think about it," she said. Zaid found her on the terrace 20 minutes later. He came to stand beside her at the railing and looked out at the garden and said nothing, and she understood they were going to do it this way, the quiet way, the way that required more honesty than either of them typically allowed themselves. "Marchetti," he said finally. "Marchetti," she confirmed. "And?" "He wants your ledger. He has friends." She paused. "The silver-haired man by the east doors is a problem." Zaid absorbed this. "What did you tell him?" "That I'd think about it." She felt him look at her sidelong. "And will you?" She turned to meet his eyes, and the space between them on the terrace railing was very small and full of something that had been building since the kitchen at 3 a.m. "Dance with me," she said. "People are watching and you look like a man who's just received bad news." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he pushed off the railing and offered his hand with the gravity of a man accepting a challenge he knows he should refuse and intends to accept anyway. The ballroom was warm and crowded, and the orchestra was playing something slow that gave them both the excuse to be close without either of them having to decide to be. His hands settled at her waist. Hers at his shoulder. They moved together with the instinctive, slightly combative ease of two people whose bodies were considerably more willing than their minds. "You're not afraid of any of them," he said quietly, close to her ear. "No. You're not afraid of me." "No," she said again. He pulled back just enough to look at her face, searching for something, she thought, though she couldn't have said what, and his expression had shed some of its usual architecture, the way a city looks different from inside a storm than it does on a clear day. Unguarded. Almost. "You should be," he said. She held his gaze and kept her voice even and let him have the line because she could afford to. "So should you," she said softly. The orchestra played on. They moved together through the warm crowded light, and neither of them looked away, and the thing that was ticking between them grew louder and steadier and closer to whatever it was counting down toward. It started with the shipment. 48 crates, bonded and cleared, moving through the port on a Thursday night the same way they had moved through every second Thursday for the better part of 3 years. The route was clean. The contacts were vetted. The window had been confirmed by 2 separate sources whose continued existence depended on their accuracy. The crates arrived empty. Not robbed, there was no sign of forced entry, no broken seals, no evidence of interference at any documented point along the chain. They simply arrived at the warehouse on the south side with nothing inside them, as though the contents had dissolved somewhere between the origin point and the dock, as though the cargo had decided of its own accord to be elsewhere. Zaid stood in the warehouse at 6 a.m. looking at 48 empty crates and felt something he rarely permitted himself to feel, the specific, cold discomfort of not understanding something. He didn't show it. He never showed it. But it was there. By the following week, 2 of his distribution contacts in the northern quarter had gone quiet. Not dead, there was a particular silence that preceded death, and he knew it well enough to recognize its absence. This was different. This was the silence of men who had simply redirected their attention, who had taken their loyalty, which he had paid for carefully and maintained meticulously, and pointed it somewhere else without the courtesy of a conversation. When Ren finally tracked one of them down through a third-party intermediary, the man had nothing useful to say and the slightly too careful expression of someone who had recently been frightened into compliance by something larger than Zaid Kestrel. That was new. That was interesting. That was, in the private architecture of his thoughts, alarming. He said none of this aloud. The estate had changed in the 3 weeks since the gala, though Zaid would have resisted that description. He would have said instead that it was functioning more efficiently, that the additional set of eyes on his network had proven operationally useful, that keeping Inara Jinx close was a strategic decision made with the same cold logic that governed all his decisions. He would have been approximately half right. She had established herself in the household the way water establishes itself in a landscape, not forcefully, not obviously, but with a patient, inevitable precision that meant one day you looked up and couldn't quite remember what the place had looked like before. She took her coffee in the kitchen at 7. She used the library in the late morning. She appeared in his study doorway in the early afternoons with observations about the network logs that were, without exception, either correct or the right kind of wrong, the kind that made you think harder rather than the kind that sent you in the wrong direction. He was aware this could be intentional. He was aware of that the way he was aware of a lot of things about her. As a fact, he had filed carefully and returned to regularly and had thus far been unable to resolve into anything actionable. She was useful. She was present. She was the most controlled person he had ever shared a building with, which in his world was either a profound qualification or a profound warning, and he had not yet determined which. At night the estate was quieter than it had ever been and somehow louder. He found himself registering her movements without meaning to. The soft sound of her door at odd hours. The faint light under the kitchen entrance when she couldn't sleep. The way she appeared at breakfast, sometimes already fully assembled, dressed, composed, the day already organized behind her eyes, and other times came down 10 minutes later than usual with something fractionally less guarded in her expression, something that suggested the night had asked something of her she hadn't entirely answered. He did not examine what he did with any of this information. The second failure came on a Tuesday. A meeting with the 3 remaining Eastern Quarter contacts, arranged through channels that only 4 living people knew about. Zaid arrived at the location, a private dining room above a restaurant that officially didn't take reservations, and found it empty. Not abandoned. Empty in the specific, deliberate way of a table that had been set and then unmade, glasses rinsed, chairs straightened, every surface wiped to a courteous blankness. A cancellation communicated through the room itself, which meant whoever had cancelled it had access to the location and wanted him to know that. He sat at the empty table for 4 minutes. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and drove back to the estate. Ren met him in the entrance hall with the expression he wore when the news was structural rather than operational, not a crisis, something worse, something load-bearing going quietly wrong. The pharmaceutical contract, Ren said. Benedetti's people are pulling out. Benedetti signed a 2-year agreement. Benedetti is no longer returning calls. Ren paused. His lawyer sent a letter this morning. Force majeure clause. They're citing changed market conditions. Zaid looked at him. That clause requires a regulatory trigger. Yes. Which means someone gave Benedetti a regulatory trigger. Yes. He took the letter and read it and handed it back and walked to his study. He sat at his desk and opened the network logs and went through them for the 4th time that week with the methodical attention of a man who believed that the answer was always in the data if you were patient enough to find it. He looked at access records and communication logs and financial movement reports and personnel schedules. He looked at everything. He did not look at the woman who had been in the adjacent room for most of the past 3 weeks. The thought crossed him, of course it did. He was not a sentimental man and sentimentality was not what was preventing him from looking at her directly. It was something more uncomfortable than that. It was the knowledge that if he looked at her with genuine suspicion and found genuine cause, something in the architecture of the past 3 weeks would have to be demolished, and he had built on it more than he'd intended to, more than was professionally sound, more than he would admit to Ren or Draco or anyone else who valued their continued employment. So he looked at the data and he looked at his contacts and he looked at the letter from Benedetti's lawyer and he looked, with mounting and exhausting attention, at every corner of his operation except the one that mattered. She found him in the study at midnight. He hadn't heard her in the doorway, another thing that was new, another thing he didn't examine, and when he looked up she was leaning against the frame with her arms folded, watching him with an expression that was too careful to be entirely neutral. You look like a man trying to solve the wrong equation, she said. Go to bed, Inara. She didn't move. How many this week? He looked at her. Failures, she said quietly. How many? The question sat between them in the lamplight. He could feel the shape of what he wasn't saying and suspected she could feel the shape of what she wasn't saying, and the room was very still around them both. 3. He said finally. She nodded, slowly, as though confirming something internal. Her expression did something complicated that he couldn't fully read, something that moved through her eyes and was gone before he could name it, leaving her face composed and unreadable as ever. "You'll find it," she said. She pushed off the doorframe and walked back down the corridor toward her room, and Zaid watched the empty doorway she'd left behind and thought, with a clarity that arrived too late and departed too quickly, that she hadn't asked him what he was looking for. She already knew what it was. The shot came from the east. Zaid heard it before he processed it, the specific, percussive crack of a high-caliber round moving faster than sound, the simultaneous explosion of the car window beside his head, the way the world compressed into a single operative second where everything irrelevant fell away and everything that mattered became luminously, brutally clear. He had Inara by the arm before the glass finished falling. They moved through the estate's side entrance and into the vehicle bay with the low, coordinated urgency of two people who had both, in different lives, done this before. He didn't have to tell her to stay low. He didn't have to tell her to move fast or stay quiet or kill the phone she pulled from somewhere in the lining of her jacket and disabled with 3 quick movements that no civilian would have known to make. He registered all of that in his peripheral vision and filed it in the part of his mind that was saving its conclusions for later, because later was a luxury that required surviving the next 40 minutes. Ren was already on the line when they hit the vehicle bay. 2 words, Eastern Perimeter, and the call dropped. The estate's defensive protocol would take over from there. His men knew what to do. The question was whether there were enough of them to do it against whatever had just arrived on his lawn. He pulled a set of keys from the board on the wall. Not the SUVs, too recognizable, too expected. A gray sedan, 4 years old, deliberately unremarkable, registered to a name that didn't exist. He'd maintained 3 of them at various locations for exactly this category of evening. "Get in," he said. She was already in. He drove for 50 minutes without speaking, taking a route that changed direction 4 times and passed through 2 car parks and a service road that technically belonged to a logistics company he'd quietly acquired 7 years ago for reasons exactly like this one. Inara sat in the passenger seat and watched the mirrors and said nothing, and the silence between them had a different quality to all the previous silences, stripped of its usual complexity, reduced to something rawer and more essential by the simple fact that someone had just tried to kill them. The safe house was in a narrow street in the old quarter, a ground-floor apartment behind an unmarked door, accessed through a courtyard that appeared to be a dead end until you knew where to look. He'd owned it for 5 years and used it twice. Inside, a living space, a kitchen the size of a generous thought, a single bedroom, and enough provisions to last a week without requiring contact with the outside world. He locked the door and stood in the entrance for a moment, listening to the building settle around them, running a final perimeter check in his head. Then he became aware that Inara was standing very still in the middle of the room, and he turned to look at her properly and saw what she had been carrying in her body since the window broke, a controlled tension, tightly managed, that was only now beginning to release in the quiet, the way a bowstring sounds different when you finally let it down. There was glass in her hair. A small cut above her left cheekbone, not deep, already clotting. She looked at him with the composure of someone who had decided composure was the only option and then kept that decision so long it had become structural, and for the first time since he'd pulled her from a warehouse all those weeks ago, he saw underneath it. He crossed the room and touched her jaw, tilting her face toward the light. She let him. That was what undid something in him, not the cut, not the glass, not the adrenaline that was still moving through his system like an electrical current looking for ground. It was that she let him. Inara Jinx, who had refused every gesture that could be read as vulnerability, who had held herself at exactly the right distance for precisely long enough, stood in the lamplight of a safe house in the old quarter and lifted her face and let him look at her. He cleaned the cut with what he found in the bathroom cabinet. She sat on the edge of the narrow kitchen counter and he stood in front of her and worked carefully, and neither of them spoke, and the room was very small around them. When he finished, she didn't move away and he didn't step back, and the distance that remained between them was no longer the professional kind. "Who knew the route tonight?" she asked. Her voice was quiet and steady. "4 people. Then you have a shorter list than you think." He looked at her. "You knew the route." Something moved through her eyes, not fear, not guilt, something more complicated than either. Yes, she said. I did. She held his gaze without flinching. And I'm still here. The logic of it landed in the silence between them. If she'd wanted him dead tonight, she'd had a window that had since closed. She was here, in this room, with glass in her hair and his hands still warm from touching her face, and whatever she was, whatever she had been in that warehouse and everything since, she had not been the one who sent the shot from the east. He knew that. He had known it on some level since the car. He hadn't wanted to know it because knowing it removed the last professionally defensible reason to keep her at arm's length. Inara. Her name in his mouth sounded different in the quiet of the safe house than it ever had in the estate. Less like an address. More like an admission. She looked up at him from the counter's edge, and the lamplight was doing something specific to the angles of her face, and the small room had run out of distance, and he had run out of the particular brand of discipline that had kept him on the correct side of this line for weeks. Don't, she said softly. Don't what? Don't decide to do this because tonight scared you. He looked at her for a long moment. It didn't scare me. It scared me, she said, and the simplicity of it, the clean, unguarded honesty of 4 words from a woman who didn't offer those, hit him somewhere below the level of strategy. He kissed her. Not the way a man kisses a woman he's been wanting to, urgent, uncontrolled, all the weeks of accumulated tension releasing at once. Slower than that. More deliberate. The way you touch something you've been circling for a long time when you finally decide that the circling costs more than the risk. She made a sound very low in her throat, and her hands came up to his jaw, and the counter's edge and the safe house and the shot from the east all dissolved into the single immediate fact of her. Later, much later, they lay in the narrow room's darkness, and the city outside was quiet, and her head was on his chest and his hand was in her hair, and the careful, constructed distance of everything that had preceded this night was gone so completely it was almost impossible to reconstruct where it had been. Tell me something true, he said to the ceiling. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then, I haven't been afraid of anything in 4 years. A pause. Until tonight. He didn't ask what had frightened her. He suspected it wasn't the shot from the east. He lay in the dark with his hand in her hair and the clock in his chest ticking the way it always did, steady and relentless, and underneath the warmth and the quiet he felt the first distant intimation of something he couldn't name yet. A shape at the edge of his understanding, patient and waiting, the way the truth tends to wait for the moment you are least equipped to receive it. He held her closer and closed his eyes. The clock kept ticking. The rain against the reinforced glass of the study was a rhythmic, dull thud, the only sound in a room that felt like the pressurized cabin of a jet. Inside, the air tasted of expensive cedar and the metallic tang of Zaid's cooling espresso. Inara sat in the velvet armchair, her legs crossed, watching the way the amber desk lamp threw Zaid's shadow against the far wall. It was long, jagged, and imposing, much like the man himself. For 6 weeks, she had lived in the guest quarters. For 6 weeks, she had played the role of the high-value refugee, the woman who had seen too much and needed the protection of the city's most dangerous shadow. And for 6 weeks, Zaid Kestrel had been cataloguing her. He watched her eat, watched her walk the perimeter of his gardens, and watched the way her breath hitched whenever he stood too close. He thought he was breaking her down, layer by layer, until only the truth remained. He didn't realize she was handing him a script, and he was reciting every line with devastating perfection. Zaid didn't look up from the 3 monitors on his desk. His fingers moved with a lethal efficiency over the mechanical keyboard, the clicks echoing like soft gunfire. The Vane Syndicate moved 3 shipments tonight, he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to bypass her ears and settle straight in her chest. They're getting desperate, Inara. They're looking for the leak that started in that warehouse. They're looking for you. Inara leaned forward, the silk of her robe slipping slightly off one shoulder. She let it stay there. And you're still protecting me, she murmured. Even though I'm a liability. Why, Zaid? A man like you doesn't keep a broken blade in his armory. Zaid finally stopped typing. He turned the chair slowly, his dark eyes locked onto hers with that same predatory intensity from the warehouse. The scar on his eyebrow seemed sharper under the desk light. He looked at her not as a prisoner, and no longer as just a guest, but as something he was beginning to claim. I don't keep broken blades, he agreed, his voice dropping an octave. He rose from the chair, his tall frame cutting off the light as he moved toward her. He didn't stop until his knees were inches from hers. He reached out, his hand hovering near her throat before his thumb traced the line of her jaw. His skin was hot, his touch possessing a terrifying weight. I keep things that are rare. And I keep things that belong to me. Inara didn't flinch. She leaned into his palm, her eyes wide and trusting, a masterpiece of deception. I can't live like this, Zaid. A ghost in a golden cage. If the veins are coming, I need to know. I need to see the storm before it breaks. Zaid's expression shifted. It was a flicker of something she had worked weeks to ignite, protective instinct clouded by an emerging, blinding affection. He hated the idea of her being blind to the danger. He wanted her to see the world through his eyes, to see how he had fortified the walls around her. Come here, he commanded. He led her back to the desk. The center monitor was a scrolling waterfall of encrypted data, the heartbeat of his empire. It was the digital ledger, a map of every bribe, every shipment, and every offshore account that kept the Kestrel name at the top of the food chain. It was the one thing he had never shown another living soul. It was his crown. Most people think power is found in a gun, Zaid said, pulling a small, heavy silver drive from his pocket. It was encrusted with a unique biometric lock. But in this city, power is knowing where the money sleeps. This is the ledger. It's encrypted with a rolling cipher that changes every 60 seconds. He took her hand. Her skin felt cool against his feverish heat. He guided her fingers to the interface, showing her the sequence. I'm giving you the bypass, he whispered, his breath fluttering the hair near her ear. If the perimeter is ever breached, if I am not here to move you, this drive is your exit. It contains the access codes to the secondary accounts and the coordinates for the extraction points in Europe. It's everything I've built. Inara felt a genuine thrum of adrenaline, though not for the reason he thought. This was it. The final piece. The encryption key she had been trying to brute force for months was now being pressed into her palm as a token of love. You're giving me this? She asked, her voice trembling with a calculated fragility. Zaid, this is your life. It's your safety, he countered, his grip on her hand tightening. I was warned that bringing you here would be a mistake. My advisors called you a jinx. They said you were the one variable I couldn't control. He turned her around, pinning her against the edge of the desk just as he had pinned her against the van in the warehouse. The symmetry wasn't lost on her. But they don't see what I see. And what do you see? She breathed, her heart racing, half from the proximity of the man, half from the sheer thrill of the kill. I see the only person in this city who doesn't want anything from me but my time, Zaid said, his eyes softening into a look that was almost painfully human. It was the ultimate irony. He was handing over the keys to his kingdom because he believed she was the only one who didn't want them. He was a man who lived by the blade, yet he was being undone by a whisper. He leaned in, his lips brushing hers in a kiss that tasted of dark promises and absolute surrender. As his arms wrapped around her, pulling her into the hard heat of his chest, Inara's hand closed tightly around the silver drive behind his back. She could feel the vibration of his heart against her own. It was strong, steady, and completely his. He was hers now. Not just the man, but the myth. The ghost of the South Side had finally been caught, and he had walked into the trap with a smile on his face. Thank you, Zaid, she whispered against his lips, her eyes cold and clear even as she returned the kiss with a simulated passion that made him groan. You have no idea what this means to me. As the monitors continued their silent, glowing vigil behind them, the rolling cipher ticked over. A new code appeared, a new path opened, and the fortress that Zaid Kestrel had spent a decade building began its silent, invisible collapse. He thought he was protecting his guest. He didn't realize that the guest had already moved the furniture and rewritten the laws of the house. The storm hadn't just arrived, it was already inside, and it was wearing a silk robe and a copper-red smile. By the time the sun rose over the Chicago skyline, the ledger would be empty, the accounts would be diverted, and Zaid Kestrel would wake up to find that the only thing left in his golden cage was the scent of white flowers and the echoing silence of a jinx that had finally run its course. But for now, in the dim light of the study, he held her tighter, believing he had finally found the one thing money couldn't buy, loyalty. And Inara let him believe it, because the only thing more satisfying than winning was watching a king hand over his crown and thank the person taking it. The poisoned gift was in her hand. The play was almost over. And as Zaid pulled her closer, whispering her name like a prayer, Inara knew that the ending was going to be exactly as she planned. Nobody had warned the Mafia boss about her until it was too late. And even if they had, she knew he wouldn't have listened. After all, who would believe that a storm could look so much like a sanctuary? The silence that followed the storm of the previous night was deceptive. It was the kind of stillness that preceded a landslide, heavy and thick with the scent of ozone and cooling rain. Zaid Kestrel stood in the center of the guest suite, the room he had once called a sanctuary for Inara, but which now felt like a crime scene. The morning light was gray and unforgiving, filtering through the reinforced windows and catching the dust motes that danced in the stagnant air. Zaid didn't move. He didn't breathe. His eyes were fixed on the small, velvet-lined jewelry box that sat open on the vanity. It was a gift he had given her 3 weeks ago, a vintage emerald pendant to match the fire in her eyes. But the emerald was gone. In its place sat a piece of technology so thin and sophisticated it looked like a shard of black glass. A high-frequency, satellite-linked comms device. Zaid reached out, his hands steady even as his world began to fracture. He picked up the device. It was warm. It had been active within the last hour. As he turned it over, a small blue light pulsed once, twice, a heartbeat that didn't belong to him. For a man who lived by his instincts, the silence in his head was deafening. Every warning his advisors had barked, every gut feeling he had suppressed in favor of the heat of her skin, now surged back with the force of a tidal wave. He had been the ghost, the predator who moved through the city unseen, untouchable. He had prided himself on seeing the play 5 moves ahead of everyone else. But as he stared at the device, the truth began to reconstruct itself in the dark corners of his mind. The warehouse ambush hadn't been a botched shipment, it had been an audition. Her rescue wasn't a stroke of luck, it was her entry point. The security breaches he thought he was solving with her help were breadcrumbs she had laid to lead him deeper into the woods. Even the night in the safe house, the way she had looked at him with such feigned vulnerability, was nothing more than a tactical maneuver to lower his final defenses. He hadn't been the cat. He had never been the cat. He had been the mouse, lured into the open by a piece of cheese that looked exactly like the one thing he had never allowed himself to want. Zaid's grip tightened on the device until the edges bit into his palm. The physical pain was a mercy compared to the cold, clinical realization that he had handed her the silver drive. He had given her the keys to his ledger, his accounts, his very life, while whispering promises of a future that she was currently dismantling. A floorboard creaked behind him. Zaid didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He could feel her presence, that low, pressurized certainty that something enormous was paying attention to him. Only now, the pressure didn't feel like desire. It felt like the weight of a guillotine. It's a beautiful piece of engineering, isn't it? Inara's voice was as smooth and calm as it had been the night she told him she loved him. There was no tremor of fear, no hint of the broken blade she had pretended to be. Zaid slowly turned to face her. She was leaning against the doorframe, dressed in the black leather combat jacket she had worn the night they met. Her hair was pulled back, sharp and severe, and her green eyes were no longer wide with feigned trust. They were narrowed, assessing, and utterly lethal. "How long?" Zaid asked. His voice was a rasp, stripped of its usual command. "From the moment you stepped into that warehouse," she said, taking a slow step into the room. She didn't look like a guest anymore. She looked like the owner. Actually, a little before that. "Your patterns were easy to read, Zaid. You're a man of habit. You like to be the hero. You like to be the one who saves the girl." "I was warned about the jinx," Zaid murmured, a dark, self-deprecating smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I thought it was just a name." "It's a promise," Inara countered. She held up her phone, the screen glowing with a series of rapidly scrolling numbers. "The ledger. The transfers are complete, Zaid. The Vane Syndicate didn't move those shipments last night, I did. Using your clearance. Your accounts are drained, your safe houses are compromised, and by the time your guards realize the biometric locks have been rewritten, I'll be halfway across the Atlantic." Zaid looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the woman behind the mask for the first time. She was magnificent. She was the most dangerous thing he had ever encountered, and even now, with his empire crumbling around his ears, he couldn't help but admire the sheer, brutal perfection of her play. "You really had me," he admitted, his voice regaining some of its steel. "The night in the safe house, was any of it real?" Inara paused. For a fraction of a second, the mask flickered. A ghost of a shadow passed over her eyes, something that might have been regret, or perhaps just a lingering ghost of the heat they had shared. Then, it was gone. Replaced by the cold, hard vacuum of the professional. "Falling for you wasn't the mistake, Zaid," she said, echoing the words of a story she had likely told herself 1,000 times. "The mistake was thinking I'd let it change the outcome." She moved toward the window, the one fitted with glass thick enough to stop a bullet. She tapped a sequence into a small remote in her hand, and the heavy panes slid open with a hiss of hydraulics. The morning air rushed in, cold and biting. "They're waiting for me," she said, glancing back over her shoulder. "In 5 minutes, the silent alarms at the perimeter will go off. Not because I'm leaving, but because your rivals have the coordinates to this room. I'd suggest you use that secondary extraction point I told you about. Assuming I didn't change the codes on that, too." Zaid stood his ground. He didn't move to stop her. He knew better than to try and catch a storm that had already passed. "Why tell me? Why not just let them find me?" Inara stood on the ledge, the wind whipping her hair around her face like a copper halo. She looked down at him, and for the briefest of moments, she looked like the girl who had leaned into his palm and asked him to see the storm. "Because a too late warning is only fun if the person is alive to hear it," she said with a sharp, crystalline laugh. "And because I want you to remember me every time you look at an empty vault." With a fluid, practiced motion, she stepped off the ledge. Zaid rushed to the window, his heart hammering against his ribs. Below, a matte black helicopter, running without lights, rose like a phantom from the tree line. Inara was hauled inside by a waiting hand, and within seconds, the craft banked hard and vanished into the gray mist of the Chicago morning. Zaid stood at the open window, the cold rain beginning to splatter against his face. He looked down at the black comms device still in his hand. The blue light pulsed one last time, then went dark. The realization hit him then, not as a shock, but as a settling weight. He had been outplayed, outmaneuvered, and utterly dismantled by the one person he thought he had saved. He was the Mafia boss that nobody had warned, not because the warnings weren't there, but because he had been too busy looking at the fire to notice the house was burning down. He looked out at the empty sky where she had been. The jinx was gone, and she had taken his world with her. He took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs, and for the first time in years, Zaid Kestrel felt a genuine spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just anger. It wasn't just loss. It was the thrill of the hunt. And this time, he knew exactly who he was looking for. Too late, Inara, he whispered into the wind, his fingers crushing the device until it shattered. We'll see about that. The blue and red strobes of police sirens sliced through the reinforced glass of the basement vault, painting the cold steel walls in a rhythmic, violent pulse of emergency. The sound was muffled by the feet of concrete above them, a frantic, distant wail that signaled the end of the Kestrel Empire. Inside the vault, the air was stagnant, smelling of ozone and the heavy, metallic scent of the massive safe door that had just been breached, not by force, but by a code Zaid had given away in a moment of blinded devotion. Zaid stood in the center of the room, his black tactical shirt damp with sweat, his chest heaving. In his hand, he held a heavy, custom-built Glock, but the barrel was lowered, pointed at the floor. He looked less like a Mafia boss and more like a man standing in the wreckage of a plane crash. Facing him, framed by the glowing monitors of the main server rack, was Inara. She wasn't running. She wasn't even flinching at the sirens. She was standing exactly where he had seen her in his dreams for the last 6 weeks, composed, ethereal, and devastating. She had swapped the silk robe for a fitted black leather utility vest over a dark bodysuit, her copper hair tied back in a knot that looked as efficient as a weapon. The sirens are 3 blocks away, Zaid, she said. Her voice was steady, but there was a new vibration in it, a fracture in the ice that hadn't been there when she stepped off the window ledge. The back elevator is still active. I left the biometric override on for your thumbprint. If you leave now, you can clear the perimeter before the tactical teams seal the block. Zaid took a step forward, his boots crunching on a stray piece of glass. He didn't look at the monitors showing his bank accounts being liquidated in real time. He didn't look at the map of his safe houses turning red as they were raided. He only looked at her. Why are you still here, Inara? He asked, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. The ledger is gone. The jinx is complete. You won. You should be on that helicopter. Inara didn't answer immediately. She tapped a final sequence into the keypad, and the sound of a heavy mechanical bolt sliding into place echoed through the vault. She was locking them in. Or locking the world out. I had a plan for everything, she whispered, stepping into the red glare of the siren light. Every variable. Every guard. Every lie I had to tell you to get that drive. She stopped an arm's length from him, her eyes searching his face with a desperate, naked intensity. But I didn't plan for the way you looked at me in the safe house. I didn't plan for the fact that when you gave me the keys to your life, you weren't doing it out of weakness. You were doing it out of a strength I've never seen. Zaid dropped the gun. It hit the floor with a heavy thud that seemed to vibrate through the soles of his boots. He reached out, his hand trembling as he gripped her upper arm, pulling her into the narrow space between his body and the server rack. You're crying, he noted, his thumb catching a single, stray tear that tracked through the grit on her cheek. The architect of my ruin is crying for me. I'm not crying for you, she snapped, though her breath hitched. I'm crying because I'm still doing it. I'm still taking it all. The takeover is automated, Zaid. Even if I wanted to stop the servers, the encryption is set to a dead man's switch. Your empire is falling, and I'm the one who pushed the button. Then stop it, he commanded, his grip tightening. He pinned her against the cold metal of the server rack, the exact same posture they had held in the warehouse, in the hallway, in the study. But the power dynamic had inverted so many times they were now just 2 ghosts in a burning house. If you love me, Inara, stop the upload. Inara looked up at him, her defiant green eyes clashing with his dark, searching gaze. For a second, the wail of the sirens seemed to fade, replaced by the thundering rhythm of 2 hearts that shouldn't be beating in the same room. I can't, she whispered, her forehead dropping against his chest. She grabbed the front of his shirt, her knuckles white. If I stop it, the people I work for, the people who have been waiting for you to fall for 10 years, they'll kill us both before we reach the street. The only way you survive tonight is if you are no longer a threat. The only way you stay alive is if you have nothing left to take. Zaid let out a sharp, jagged laugh. He tilted her chin up, forcing her to look at the wreckage she had made. So this is your mercy? You strip me of my crown to save my head? I'm saving the man, she said, her voice finally breaking. I don't care about the boss. I never did. She reached up, her hands cupping his face, her touch a frantic contrast to the cold steel surrounding them. She kissed him then, a desperate, bruising collision of teeth and tongue that tasted of salt and the end of the world. It was a kiss of betrayal and absolute, terrifying loyalty. Zaid returned it with a ferocity that spoke of a man who had lost everything and found the only thing that mattered in the ruins. He backed her further against the rack, his body shielding her from the flashing lights of the sirens, caging her in one last time. Outside, the screech of tires and the shouting of tactical teams signaled that the perimeter had been breached. The lights in the vault flickered as the main power grid was cut, leaving them in the dim, pulsing red of the emergency backup. Inara pulled back, her chest heaving, her lips swollen. She reached into her utility vest and pulled out a small, nondescript keycard, not silver, not branded, just a plain white card. She pressed it into his hand. The south exit, she whispered as the first heavy thuds of a battering ram echoed from the floors above. There's a motorcycle in the maintenance tunnel. The codes are already in the ignition. It leads to a shipyard in Gary. From there, you disappear. Zaid looked at the card, then back at her. And you? Inara stepped back, moving into the shadows of the server racks where the red light couldn't reach her. She looked like a ghost again. A jinx. I have to stay to confirm the transfer. I have to be the one they find standing over the empty vault. Inara. Go, she screamed, the sound echoing off the steel walls. If they find us together, they'll know. They'll know it wasn't a hit. They'll know it was a choice. Go, Zaid. Please. Don't let the last 6 weeks be for nothing. Zaid Kestrel, the man who had ruled the South Side with an iron fist, stood for one final heartbeat in the red-tinted dark. He looked at the woman who had ruined him, the woman who had stolen his life to give him a chance to live it. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say I love you. Those words were too small for the carnage they had created. He turned and ran for the back elevator, the white card gripped in his hand like a lifeline. Inara stood in the center of the vault, listening to the lift whine as it ascended. She turned back to the monitors. The progress bar reached 100%. Transfer complete. Database purged. She leaned her head back against the cold server rack and closed her eyes. The heavy boots of the tactical team were now at the vault door. The grinding of a thermal saw began to spark through the steel. She smiled, a small, sad, and triumphant thing. Nobody had warned the Mafia boss about her until it was too late. But nobody had warned her about him either. The door began to give. Inara Jinx straightened her vest, wiped the last of the tears from her face, and waited for the light to break in. The silence that followed the storm was absolute. The sirens had faded into the distance, carrying with them the last echoes of the empire Zaid Kestrel had spent a decade building. The smoke from the thermal saws still curled lazily in the cold vault air, but the tactical teams were gone, leaving behind only shadows and the heavy scent of spent adrenaline. Zaid stood at the edge of the rooftop, the gray Chicago dawn finally breaking over the skyline. He wasn't on a motorcycle in a maintenance tunnel, and he wasn't halfway to a shipyard in Gary. He was exactly where he had been for the last hour, watching. A soft footfall behind him didn't make him turn. He knew the rhythm of that walk now. It was ingrained in his pulse. You didn't leave, Inara said. Her voice was stripped of the clinical coldness she had used in the vault. She sounded tired, the weight of the jinx finally pressing down on her shoulders. She was still wearing the black tactical gear, but her hands were empty, the silver drive likely already in the hands of her handlers. I don't run from my own house, Inara, Zaid said, turning slowly. His face was a mask of bruised exhaustion and something sharper, a new kind of clarity. Even if the locks had been changed. Inara stopped a few feet away. The wind whipped her copper hair across her face, but she didn't move to brush it away. The transfer is complete. Kestrel Capital officially no longer exists. On paper, you are a ghost. You have no assets, no safe houses, and no soldiers. You're free. Free, Zaid repeated, the word tasting like ash. He moved toward her, his presence still commanding the space even without a throne to back it up. He stopped when he was close enough to see the exhaustion in her eyes. You stripped me of everything to save my life. That was your play. But you forgot one variable. What variable? She breathed. You, he said, his hand reaching out to cup the back of her neck. He didn't pin her this time, he held her with a steady, grounding force. You think I can just go back to being a ghost after having you under my skin for 6 weeks? You think I'm going to let you walk back to the people who sent you to ruin me? Inara's breath hitched. Zaid, they think I've finished the job. They think you're gone. If I don't go back, they'll hunt me. They'll realize that the jinx was compromised. Let them hunt, Zaid whispered, his forehead dropping against hers. They spent 10 years trying to take me down from the outside and failed. You took me down in 40 days because you were the only one who saw the man behind the boss. Now, they're facing a man who has nothing left to lose and everything to gain. He pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes. The ledger is empty, but the knowledge is still here. I know where the bodies are buried, Inara. I know where the leverage is hidden. And now, I have the architect of the most perfect heist in history standing right in front of me. Inara looked at him, the realization beginning to dawn in her eyes. She wasn't just his ruin. She was his new beginning. The people who had sent her had wanted Zaid Kestrel out of the way so they could carve up the city. They hadn't realized that by sending Inara, they had given the one man they feared the only partner he was ever capable of trusting. You want to rebuild, she said, a small, dangerous smile finally touching her lips. With me. I don't want to rebuild the old way, Zaid said, his grip tightening. The old way was a fortress. It was lonely. I want to build something far more terrifying. I want to build a kingdom where nobody sees the walls coming until they're already inside. The sun finally broke over the horizon, casting a long, golden light across the rooftop. They stood together, the man who had lost a crown and the woman who had stolen it, looking out over a city that had no idea the rules had just changed. Zaid Kestrel was no longer the sole boss. The shadows were no longer his alone. Together with Inara, he was something the underground wasn't prepared for, a predator who knew how it felt to be the prey. They warned me about you, Inara, Zaid murmured, leaning down to claim her lips in a kiss that was no longer about betrayal, but about a dark, unbreakable pact. And they were right. You were a jinx. Inara pulled him closer, her hands sliding up his chest to lock behind his neck. And they warned me about the Kestrel, she whispered against his mouth. They said nobody had ever survived you. They were right about that, too, Zaid said, a low, lethal growl in his voice. Because the man I was didn't survive you. But the man I am? He's just getting started. He was warned, but the jinx had been worth the fall. As they walked toward the edge of the roof together, the dust of the old empire settling beneath their boots, it was clear that the too late warning had finally expired. The Mafia boss was back. And this time, he wasn't alone. Long live the Queen. And that, my beautiful family, is where we leave Zaid and Inara for today. The dust has settled, but the fire is only just beginning to spread. I have to know, did you see that twist coming? Or did the jinx catch you off guard, too? Drop your theories in the comments. I love reading how you think this will end. If this story touched you, or if you're just as obsessed with Zayd's fall from grace as I am, please give this video a thumbs up. It truly helps our little community grow. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you never miss a chapter of this journey. Thank you for spending your time with me today. It means the world to have you here in this family. Please, take care of yourselves, stay kind to one another, and I will see you very soon in the next story. I love you all. Bye for now.